Thanks everyone for joining. I'm David and I am privileged to welcome Zoe Gibson. So Zoe and I actually had the chance to work together at the Atlantic several years ago. So I know firsthand what a great colleague and what a great thinker she is. After the Atlantic, she joined Government Executive, which is a site for federal employees. And then now she's leading growth at Morning Brew for some of the industry newsletters. So Zoe, you can probably introduce yourself better than me. Would love to hear a little bit about your background and sort of how your thinking about audience has evolved over that period.
Yeah, totally. And so excited to be here with all of you guys from all over the world. What a great end to the week. And thanks for joining from odd hours, where I'm sure some of you guys are having to right now. So thanks. And yeah, as David said, we had the opportunity to work together when he was actually my manager during my internship years and years ago. So we've stayed close since then. I then went on to the events division within the Atlantic called Atlantic Live, which is a live events division. We did over 150 events a year around the country and some international as well, ranging from small roundtable events of about 20 people on a particular subject, all the way up to huge multi-day festivals like the Atlantic Festival, City Lab, and Aspen Ideas Festival. And from there, after a couple of years, first in event marketing, which was marketing our events primarily through email marketing to drive registration and attendance. I later worked in the sales team doing strategy and operations, still with the events division, and then later moved to a brand that David mentioned called Government Executive, which was a very DC-based media company focused on media for public servants, so for government workers, and was there for several years and then landed at Morning Brew just at the beginning of this year to lead growth for our industry products, which are marketing brew, retail brew, and emerging tech brew.
Amazing. Well, awesome. So how we'll use the time, we'll really dig into Zoe's time at Morning Brew and how she's thinking about growth for the industry-focused newsletters. And along the way, we'll talk about tips and tricks and tactics for newsletters writers to grow their audience. And also for those who are attending live, please add questions in the chat as we go, and I'll be sure to integrate them to the conversation. Well, so maybe to start, so you were at Government Executive, which is for federal managers, and then even has sort of like niches within kind of that broader category. And then, at Morning Brew, we've got different niches for the various industries. Would love to hear, like at a high level, like how you think about kind of defining those audiences or thinking about niches.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's been really fascinating for me how applicable the experience from Government Executive has been so far in my time at Morning Brew, which was really surprising to me because for those of you who aren't familiar with these two brands, they could not be more different. On the Morning Brew front, it's like emojis, pop culture, very like millennial Gen Z, internet native, and Government Executive is a over 50-year-old brand focused on public servants and government workers, which, as we know, at least the Americans among us, our government isn't always the most up to speed on things. So it was very different brands, but what I've been fascinated by is how much this strategy of niche has served me well moving from Government Executive to Morning Brew, and particularly my job growing the B2Bs, the industry products for Morning Brew. And so what I mean by that is Government Executive had this 50-year-old brand and their mission was to create journalism for public servants. But about 10 years ago, they made their 10-year strategy, and the strategy really was to niche the niche. So they were already operating in this niche, which was public servants, and they decided we're going to introduce additional brands that serve sub audiences within that audience of government workers. And so those brands became eventually Defense One, which is focused on national security and defense, Route 50, which is focused on state and local government, and NextGov, which is focused on technology and government. So they basically had this strategy of niching the niche, serving that audience in a more specific way, and also having additional products to monetize. And so that's been really fascinating, because in my current role at Morning Brew, I am operating essentially on the niche products from the original flagship newsletter. So maybe it would be helpful just to back up a little bit for those who aren't familiar with Morning Brew. It has been around for about 5 years now, and they started with just a single product, one daily business newsletter that went out in the morning. That's why it's called the Morning Brew. And the idea was to take business news and make it really digestible and really fun. And they've grown this audience of super audience of just rabid followers, over 3 million. And in recent years, they've introduced additional products to serve sub-communities within that broader audience. So my role is on those industry products, like I said, which is meeting the audience at their professional needs. So we have people who work in retail, marketing, and emerging tech brew, and are coming to our newsletters, not only to be informed and entertained, but also to improve in their jobs. And kind of to your point of niching the niche, one thing that we think about a lot, and that my general manager of B2B talks about in terms of our strategy, is both our strategy for breadth and our strategy for depth. And so from a business perspective, breadth might mean introducing additional industry franchises. If we see, for example, there's a big healthcare audience, that's not one that's in the works, so I'm not giving anything away, but introducing more breadth. And then depth would mean looking at sub-verticalization. So within Marketing Brew, are there a lot of people who are interested in SEO or email marketing or social media marketing? And so introducing products that are even more niche than our niche products. So in sum, yes, it's been really surprising but heartening how transferable the experience has been for brands that could not be more different.
Totally. Yeah, niching the niche, such a great term. So let's dig in more to Morning Brew. So would be interested to hear, just sort of at a high level, how are you guys thinking about growth?
Yeah, so I can kind of talk through it in a couple of different ways. I think we'll spend the majority of time talking about the industry products, since that is my specific role. But I sit within the growth team led by our great VP who came over from Stitcher, and she was actually responsible for introducing the first paid podcast subscription. So she just brings a wealth of knowledge in terms of the monetization of content, relationships, community, so on and so forth. And within our team, there is a sub-team focused on what we call B2C, which is the flagship daily business newsletter, and then our lifestyle content. And then I lead the B2B side, which, as I said, are the industry products of Marketing Brew, Retail Brew, and Emerging Tech Brew. And so what's really cool about kind of the conversation that we're having today is you're kind of catching us at the ground floor of the strategy for B2B, because historically, as I said, it was only that daily business newsletter for so long, for multiple years. And so the strategy was always to invest time, staff, resources, thought into the daily newsletter. And then people would just love that so much that they would kind of flow through to all of our other franchises or newsletters. We term them franchises. That just means brands, essentially. So Retail Brew would be a brand. It would be a franchise, not just a newsletter, because it exists on multiple platforms. But to that point, what's really cool is the reason I was brought in was to give specific focus to the B2Bs, to these industry products. And what is exciting for me is that it requires a really different approach and a really different strategy from the way that they've done things and are going to continue to do things on the B2C side. So to kind of tease that out a little bit more, for the B2Bs, we don't just care about raw growth. you know, we really care who the people are, because if you have a Morning Brew newsletter, you want these people to be in marketing. And so the challenge there is to find both the quality and the scale when you're thinking about growing the newsletter. And so a lot of the tactics that the B2C side employs and that the company has employed historically for growth, which is to focus on a lot of scalable channels like YouTube influencers, Facebook, Instagram, Gmail, paid acquisition. They operate in a lot of scalable channels and they are always seeking more scale. But for the industry products, it gets a little bit challenging because we need that targeting, like I said. And so as a result of that, we have to look to places where those audiences hang out. So to use the example of Morning Brew, I have to find channels where marketers hang out. And a lot of those, just by the nature of it, are smaller. So there's kind of two ways that this manifests. Either we could exhaust those channels very quickly. So we could be advertising in a newsletter that has a total reach of 20,000 marketers, and that doesn't scale. Or scalable channels might become too price prohibitive because we are layering that filtering on top. So, you know, we could advertise on LinkedIn, which is a scalable channel, but then if we only want to reach marketers, all of a sudden that becomes more targeted and more expensive as a result. So I am thinking about the B2B growth and the industry growth in a kind of completely different framework from the way that my colleagues, who are the people that I work with every day and strategize with, are operating their work streams. And so I can kind of, I'll pause and see if you have any quick thoughts, and then I'll jump into some of the ways that I'm thinking about B2B in a way that's different from the historical growth strategy.
Totally. Yeah, that sounds great. Let's talk tactics. What are some of the top sort of like tactics you're thinking about?
Yeah. So a big one, like I said, is, you know, finding those places where our audience resides. So thinking, you know, just literally took a whiteboard and it's like, okay, what influencers do marketers follow? What newsletters do marketers read? What blogs do marketers care about? So on and so forth, like go through every medium. And so this falls into the bucket of kind of more of the quick wins. So a big thing that Morning Brew does and has done well is advertising in newsletters. So one thing I'm thinking about right now in a less sustainable channel for the B2Bs is something that we call cross promos, where we basically find another newsletter that's doing really cool stuff, reaching the audience that we want to reach, and do basically an inventory swap for our advertising. And so I am teeing up a lot of those right now. And one of the reasons that that works really well is something that we say a lot internally is people who read newsletters read newsletters. And that might sound funny, but what we mean by that is if we want to find people for Morning Brew or for the other franchises such as Morning Brew who are going to read our newsletters, it's a really good idea to seek out people who are already reading other newsletters, because you're self-selecting for the intended behavior that you're hoping your people will have. And so it actually tends to be a lower cost channel and is really effective in driving quality subscribers to the brand. But one of the challenges that I mentioned is that it can be harder to scale, especially if you're looking for a really targeted audience, such as, you know, just marketers. So that is definitely one of the categories. I heard you.
Oh yeah, I would love to like maybe go a little bit deeper on cross promo. It feels like this is like a really actionable insight for a lot of our viewers and listeners who, you know, are looking to grow their newsletters, and that like could totally imagine, you know, partnerships, just sort of like not even necessarily needing to pay for advertising, but like forming a partnership with a fellow newsletter writer and kind of doing cross promo in newsletters. And this actually relates to one question we got in the chat, which is like how to grow to organically at a shoestring budget. So maybe like thinking about that, and then also like for someone who's thinking about using kind of cross promo and looking to find newsletters to potentially partner with? Like
Mm-hmm.
what are tactics you might find to like figure out the right newsletters to do promo with?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just taking down a couple of notes. I'm a very tactile person. So the fundamental idea of a cross promo is very similar to something that I had a lot of experience with in my previous jobs at Atlantic and Government Executive, which was, we would call it house promo. It was the idea that whenever we had unsold ad inventory that would otherwise be filled by a client, but for that reason, like we just didn't have demand on that particular day, so it was empty, don't not use it and promote something else within your ecosystem. So an example would be if we had if we had unsold inventory in a Defense One newsletter, let's promote signups for another newsletter. So it's the idea of squeezing the most out of the lemon so that you're always using the available kind of eyeball moments that you have with your audience to bring about the overall growth effect that you want. But more tactically and specifically for cross promos, the idea would be to find other newsletters that you think your target audience is reading. Oftentimes a good place to start, especially if you are the writer or the proprietor of your newsletter, is like, what newsletters are you reading? Because very likely there is some topical overlap there. And then it would just be reaching out and seeing if they were open to an arrangement where you would basically, as I said, you would promote them in your newsletter, they would promote you in their newsletter. These are really mutually beneficial arrangements. And then in terms of logistics, what we typically look for, and like you said, in order to make a successful one, I think really important is to look at newsletters that have high engagement. So are people, like if their list size is 200,000, what is their open rate? How many people are actually opening? And so the way that we determine what we consider a fair swap is we do it based on unique opens. So if the list size is 100,000, but only 50% are opening it, then they would have 50,000. And so if our unique opens were 100,000, we would say, hey, this is going to be a 2-to-1 swap, so that you're basically finding, the denominator, which is how many eyeballs are going to see this on either side. The reason you would also want to look for a partner who had high engagement is that is an instance in which it's more likely that people will have eyeballs on the promotion that is being done for your newsletter. And then I would say another thing that is important to finding success and is just tracking links are your friends. Whenever you do a promotion anywhere, any marketing on the internet, use a tracking link. And you can do more research about how to create them. It's pretty simple. But the idea of that is that you want to be able to attribute and know how many people came in your ecosystem from any specific promotion that you're doing. And that allows you to see which ones are the most successful so that you can scale up there, scale down elsewhere. And I was actually telling David prior to this that I was always amazed working in media more on the client side and setting up advertising campaigns for clients, how rarely the largest corporate clients use tracking links. Like that is the name of the game. You need to be able to prove effectiveness of anything that you're doing from a marketing standpoint. So I would say tactically, those are a couple of things that come to mind. And then I would say the organic on a shoestring budget, that's a little bit of it there because that is a barter situation, so it's free. But I am going to speak more to a couple of other tactics too.
Totally. Yeah, the cross promo is it's a beautiful idea in many ways, in that it can apply across no matter how big you are. If you have 100,000 newsletter subscribers, partnering with someone of similar size, if you've got 100 newsletter subscribers, partnering with someone similar size to get to the next tier. So awesome. So you kind of framed that as like a quick win sort of category of growth that you might like hit the end of at some time. What other tactics are you thinking about that are sort of longer term?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm really excited about those cross promos. I think they give a good like match, like a little bit of fire to get things started. But as you said, I am very mindful of kind of the diminishing returns of certain channels. If they are only so big, eventually the way that math works is you will exhaust it. So a couple of ways that I am thinking about that specific to the industry products of keeping scale and keeping quality. One that is kind of foundational to how I'm starting to build this strategy coming in and to this role in 2021 is something that I've termed the peer effect, which is essentially, I sat back, I was like, okay, how do I get a lot of people in retail and keep costs low? And I was like, I need to get retail people to tell other retail people about our brand. And so the peer effect manifests in a lot of ways, but essentially what it is the idea of tapping into networks. And so I can talk about a couple of ways that we do that and ways that I'm thinking about it. At a high level, a couple of examples are referrals. We have Morning Brew traditionally has a really strong referral program, and we're revisiting kind of how the program can better serve the industry products specifically as well, and get people really bringing in their colleagues, their direct reports, their managers, their teams, people in their industry. Another one that is a big one and that I have the benefit of a couple of years of experience in is events. Events are a really social platform. So when people go to events, they want to bring their friends, they want to go with their friends, they don't want to go alone, and they want to talk about it with their friends. And so what we see, both at Morning Brew and especially when I was doing live events at the Atlantic, is that people will register their friends. And so you basically just get free growth for your brand by holding events, because people will bring their friends. And oftentimes, for example, if you're having a marketing event, they're going to bring other marketers. So they bring people in your target audience for free. And there's an additional element there, like I said, of just word of mouth. I saw a really cool white paper when I was doing strategy and ops for our sales team that I helped integrate into some of our client marketing, that people talk about, consumers talk about experiential marketing or events. So you basically get word of mouth amplification of what you're doing, because when it's experiential, people want to share that with others. So in terms of peer effect, referrals, events, and then a couple of other ways that we tap into it. One is the personal brand of employees, which is actually really big. If you guys have seen, or you might have seen, Morning Brew employees are like all over the internet. They're like all over Twitter, all over LinkedIn. We have this ethos called building in public. And so people are really kind of out there sharing the work that they do, whether it is kind of more on the business side of Morning Brew and sharing like tips about sales or whatever, or if they are the writers and the journalists themselves sharing kind of their stories and their beats with the world. And so we see a lot of people come in and discover our brand through our employees who are out there just kind of spreading the word and sharing the excitement about what we do. And then a couple of other kind of primary subcategories within the peer effect are, we have for one of our brands, and I'm really interested in introducing it for the others, for Retail Brew, we do community reader profiles every Wednesday. So there's a section every Wednesday in the newsletter issue called Co-working, where we will interview a reader of Retail Brew, and there's a really great image of them in a Q&A. And it's personally, even before I started working here, it was one of my favorite sections, because it's so human bringing in someone from the audience. But from a growth perspective, when I'm thinking about it, for the peer effect, we would see that those people who were profiled, who were, like I said, in retail, target audience, bing, 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 we would see that they would very often ad hoc share it on LinkedIn or Twitter or wherever, because of course you would. That's like a huge moment for your career if a major brand in your industry profiles you. And so one thing that we're thinking about is just putting a little bit more process around that, so that whenever someone is profiled, giving them the header, giving them like best practices if you want to share this, and by no means like mandating it, but basically just making it easier for people to share the content, because that is the intended behavior that we want. So we shouldn't just leave it kind of up to chance and put the burden on that person to figure out how to best do that. Oh, sorry, I saw you jumping in.
Oh no, yeah, it's a really cool idea, and sort of it's nice to hear that even like such a large brand like Morning Brew, like that sort of approach can like moves the dial, and it's something that's also one of those ideas that's sort of really accessible to anybody. I'd be curious to go a little bit deeper there, like for folks who are attending or listening, thinking about doing reader profiles. How would you think about like kind of like the blocking and tackling of that, like figuring out what makes a good person to profile, or making sure that you're maximizing the impact of that profile on growth?
So I can't speak to the first question because that lives with the editorial team entirely in terms of deciding who is, you know, content worthy, what they're going to talk about. But I can, you know, speak a little bit to squeezing the most juice out of the lemon and the max impact. So when we're thinking about it, we're thinking about, as I said, just implementing more process around it and like systematizing it so that Sarah T, who is my wonderful teammate who works with me on the B2B side, she is actually working on this process right now, but it'll be something like whenever someone is profiled, after the profile is live, they will receive a really nice designed image of them that already is the one that runs in the newsletter, but we can give them a couple of different sizes, and then best practices for sharing it, sharing links, and a little bit of like draft copy if they don't want to have to come up with their own. And then I think also something that might be helpful, which isn't fully in my terrain, but in terms of the logistics of how our team does this, they have a Google form that they, each Wednesday, they will run the profile of somebody. So they're like, Jane from Target who does merchandising, and they intro her in the top blurb and they say, if you're interested in being profiled, complete this form. So that's where they collect like interest, basically they collect leads for the profile, and then they run the Q&A. And then I don't know so much beyond that just because of the wall between business and edit, but I would imagine that then they look at the submissions that people have shared, and then they reach out to those they would be interested in kind of doing the full profiles for.
Interesting. Very cool. And then maybe going a little bit deeper on events. So you mentioned events is a great like social platform. People bring their friends. So for writers who are attending and listening, how would you think about like, I guess one, when it makes sense to do an event, like it can be like a time consuming thing. You're taking time away from writing. So like, how do you do that? Think about that balance. And then what makes for a good event when you're doing an event for subscribers?
So it is such an interesting question, and this, whenever people in the broader content space learn that I come from an events background, they always have the idea or the interest of introducing events, and so I get a lot of questions about like, oh, should we do events? Actually, when I was in London, I know we have someone here from London, visiting my cousin a couple of years ago, her husband worked at Great Big Story, and he was like, I think we're going to introduce an events division. And what I always tell people is events take way more work than you think. I will never go to an event again and like not see the name badges and all the little designed things and think about someone folding them and cutting them out and whatnot. There's a lot of invisible labor. However, so I would say events in the formal sense, as you might think of them, are very expensive, very time consuming, very laborious, and require like a certain level of expertise to get right. That being said, I think events in the broader sense of get together is something that every creator should really consider. There's so many tools now, even like we're doing right now, Zoom, that allow you to connect with your people and foster community in a way that costs a lot less and is a lot easier, which is not to say that David didn't do a lot of work for today. But I think the point being, it still will require time away from writing, but it's a much lower bar, and it's one that I definitely would recommend people consider doing virtual things like a Zoom or like Twitter Spaces, Clubhouse, all of those kind of places that have made it easier to get your people together in a virtual environment. So So those are kind of the main things I would share for those who are considering events. They're very powerful, very high impact medium, but definitely be mindful of if you have the bandwidth and if you're going to do it, how you're going to like manifest that vision, whether it's live or virtual.
Totally. Right. So we talked about like tools here for events. Also talked about kind of leveraging like tools and products in other ways. And I know that like Morning Brew has access to like product and tools at a scale kind of larger than your average individual kind of newsletter writer. But you know, every newsletter writer has their suite of tools that they are using. Curious to hear sort of how Morning Brew thinks about like leveraging the product to grow, and then like how any sort of like ways to think about like the tools you're using and like making sure that you're using them to your best advantage on growing your audience.
Yeah, this is actually, out of everything, probably the thing that I'm the most passionate about, especially because nobody on this call works in print media. We all work in digital content. So the digital piece is really important because it's kind of the infrastructure that is that enables your entire enterprise. And so when I think about sustainable growth strategies for the industry products of finding scale and quality, one piece is the peer effect. And then the second piece is product-led growth. And so I'll give you an example that I think will help illuminate this. So when we were kind of shopping around in February for event softwares, because we were kicking off Morning Brew's first ever events, my colleague Eleni, who had been with me at Atlantic Live, came over as the director of events, and she was responsible for building the team and the strategy from the ground up. So I was working with her in the audience capacity in terms of basically data and tools that would enable us to do the types of audience and growth work that we would need out of events. And I made a list of criteria for any software that we were going to consider. And one of the big ones was that the software would allow for a +1 feature. And what this means is whenever someone is registering, it gives them the automatic prompt to add a friend. It actually, the one that we use, Splash, it allows you to add up to 10 friends. You can set it on the back end. We right now have it at 5 because that's kind of a long registration form. Anywho, the point of this was I knew from my time at Atlantic that whenever we had an event, a very like significant number of people would add friends. They might, you know, and in a different scenario, send the website to their friend, and then their friend might go by themselves to the website and then register, but there's just a lot more friction. They also might not even think about adding a friend unless they saw that prompt, like, oh, add a friend. They might not think that they could. If they got an invite individually, they might not realize that it was open to the public, so on and so forth. So that was one thing that was on my criteria of basically like, how can we make this tech work for us? And we now get over 40 people per event coming in that way. And 40 is not a large number, but that's 40 people each event that we wouldn't have otherwise. And that will just continue to build and build and build every single time we have an event. And so that is one. Another kind of example of what it looks like to think about product-led growth is right now, when you go to Morning Brew's website and you register for the daily, which is that flagship newsletter, the morning business newsletter, the main product that most people are going to our website to register for. Once you proceed through the subscription flow, you get what we call an on-site confirmation. It's like, great, you're subscribed. And on that page, it's like, here are other newsletters. And it gives kind of a little bit of copy for each newsletter and bullet points. But if you were in our current tech situation to click Marketing Brew on that page, it bounces you out to another landing page where then you need to enter your email address again and go through the flow again. So what I'm working with the product team right now is a ticket to make that a one-click subscription. Since we've already got their email address, they just went through the flow. And then when they click that they want to subscribe to Morning Brew, they should just be subscribed. So it's just little things about that. I think one of my biggest recommendations for those who work in digital content would be to be very intentional about your tools. And that kind of takes two forms. One is making sure you have the best tools to meet your objectives. So that's kind of the example of that I first gave of like, I knew when we were getting an events platform, it needed to be able to do X, Y, Z, so on and so forth. And we were going to make trade-offs if one didn't have everything based on those objectives. And then the other I would say is take advantage of all the features you have available to you. So if you're paying for something, make sure you're using all of it. So I would say like, if the softwares that you use send emails like Splash, Sailthrough, all the ones that we use, they send like basically content marketing emails to keep their users in the loop and engaged. But I always read them because if they're introducing new features or they have updates, like you just kind of want to know everything that is available to you as a creator to grow your audience and make sure that you are getting everything out of the tools that you're using.
Totally. That's great. So we have a question in the chat. So from John, what's an open rate that you get excited about? I asked because a marketing consultant told me that she thought 15% was a good open rate. I responded, 85% of people not opening your newsletter sounds like a disaster to me. It's a good question. And yeah, would love to hear reactions to that, as well as maybe like a little more broadly, like thinking about how Morning Brew thinks about engagement and optimizing engagement for folks that are already subscribers.
Totally. So that's actually a great question. It's not too niche. I think the reason it's such a great question is that most people don't engage with emails. So for most emails, 15% would be an awesome open rate, which is really sad because as you said, that means 85% of people aren't engaging with you. One of the reasons that I came to Morning Brew is because of engagement, and David and I have had the chance to talk about this a lot, so I'll kind of dig into it and tease it out. But for Morning Brew, our newsletters are all hovering around 40+%. Some of the smaller ones are closer to 50%, which is insanely high as it relates to both email broadly, which would contain, of course, like all of your retail marketing, your like Comcast emails, things like that, but then also email-based media. It's insanely high. And so when I think about engagement, it's such a good question on your end and also on David's end, because acquisition is only half the battle. I think when people think about growth, they think about getting new bodies in the door, but there's this whole other half of it, which is keeping them around and keeping them engaged. And I think that part is not sexy at all. And it's also really easy to mask that things are not going well there. If you keep pulling people in the door, you might not notice that there's a lot of people going out the door as well. And so this was kind of emphasized to me a lot when I did this amazing kind of growth foundations course with a company called Reforge that's based out of Silicon Valley. And the biggest thing that they emphasized in this course, I think there were 6 modules, and the first one was retention and engagement. And they're like, retention and engagement is the most important piece of growth because it has kind of like positive or negative effects on everything else that you do, from monetization to acquisition, so on and so forth. So to, use that example with acquisition, if more people are staying around, if you're retaining more people, then they're more likely to refer more people, which means your acquisition gets bigger. If you have fewer people staying around, then there's fewer people to refer people, so your acquisition gets smaller. So even acquisition is affected by your retention and engagement. But yes, so one of the main reasons that I went to Morning Brew and found it to be such an exciting place is that their North Star really is engagement. They sell their newsletter sponsorships based on opens, which is not the market standard. Most media companies sell based on list size. So they're actually incentivize to keep the overall list size high, even if those people are not opening, which one, does not serve the audience. Two, it does not serve the client, because the client is buying based on overall list size, not based on how many people are even opening the newsletter. And opening the newsletter doesn't even mean that they're clicking on your ad. So I found it really refreshing that Morning Brew completely oriented their business model to incentivize engagement. And one way that they did that is they're very purposeful about list hygiene and churning your list. And I'll kind of get into this a little bit because there's some technicals there, but they churn people who are not engaging with the list anymore in order to keep deliverability high. And deliverability is like this whole world within the email space, but essentially what it boils down to, even though it sounds kind of technical, is that as an email-based human, doesn't even have to just be media companies, you get punished for bad behavior in the inbox and you get rewarded for good behavior. And so what that might look like is if email service providers consider you as somebody who's being like reckless in the inbox, you might be more likely to go to spam. You might be more likely to go to the promotions tab rather than the main inbox. And so there's a couple of things you can do to improve your deliverability. And I would say, and deliverability, of course, is going to be directly related to engagement if you're an email-based company, because if you're not showing up in people's inboxes, they're less likely to engage with you. I would really recommend on More for Deliverability reading this great resource by Dan Oshinsky, who used to work at The New Yorker and I think BuzzFeed as well in email. He does a resource called Not a Newsletter. It goes out, it kind of is a newsletter, but it's a Google Doc that he sends every month, and it just pulls in all of the kind of trends and best practices for email. And so he'll always kind of tell you what's going on with deliverability. But two kind of tactical things I would recommend are churning your list, so removing people who aren't opening. And then another one that I think is a great and very actionable thing, especially for smaller proprietors, is responding to your readers, because the email service providers reward you if you have a two-way connection with your readers, because it signals to them that those people want to receive your emails, and so you must be doing something good. And so then you get rewarded for deliverability. And so what you'll see actually is that a lot of people have started in their welcome emails, in their confirmation email, for example, saying like, welcome to my list, respond to this email with the most recent movie you read, or something silly, because it gets people to start responding. And then it does two things for the creator. It helps your deliverability, and it also helps you get quick information about and build relationships with your readers. So that's something that I've seen a couple of people start doing that I think is pretty clever. And some will even mention in the conversation that, or in the email, it's like, reply to me and this will help my deliverability. So you can kind of appeal to that. And this is something, like I said, that, you know, companies of any size can do. It was really foundational to Morning Brew, and it's continued to be. And now that we have scaled so much, we actually have a whole fleet of what we call inbox interns who are on the inboxes every day, responding to readers, building those relationships, and helping our deliverability as well.
Cool, really interesting. I see we've got a couple questions here, and I know we're up on time, but I know Zoe and I have some extra minutes here. If folks are able to stick around, we can get into the additional questions. So first in the chat, what if the newsletter is not the signature product, but a promotional tool itself? How do we grow that? So maybe a corollary here a little bit is we've got the Morning Brew flagship, and then the sub newsletters that are often kind of offshoots. So anyway, how would you think about kind of a portfolio where you have a free thing or a thing that you're trying to promote and then funnel into something else?
Well, I think in order to answer it, I'd actually really love to ask, what is the signature product? Because that would definitely inform the context.
Totally. Yeah, if you're there, feel free to unmute or respond in the chat. Here we go. Design consulting.
I see. So the newsletter is essentially content marketing for a much higher value product. So that's actually really smart on your end that you have that newsletter product. Another thing that they introduced in the Reforge class that I thought was brilliant and that I had noticed anecdotally but hadn't had a framework to think about is that if the natural frequency of your product is really infrequent, so something like needing a design consultant or buying a house, you really should layer on additional products that have a higher natural frequency to keep people engaged. And so the example that they used was Zillow, and that Zillow initially was like primarily for helping people buy houses, but then they realized you don't buy a house very often. So they added on Zestimate, and they added on rental, and they added on all of these products that have a much higher frequency and keep you engaged. So I would say just kudos to you for having this content tool that's keeping your people around. And is your question about how you grow the consulting or how you grow the newsletter, even if the newsletter is not the primary product for you? And we'll give you a second, both in a sense. I would say a good one always, and just kind of very foundational to my passion and why I am in media and why I'm at Morning Brew in media is audience, your audience, talk to your audience. So I would say in order to grow both your newsletter and especially your design consulting, I would talk to your audience and get a sense for what are their needs, if they're being served, so on and so forth. And that will especially help you grow the consulting. So I would say use your newsletter as an opportunity to get more engagement with your audience so that you can have like conversations with them essentially that will allow you to learn what you need to do in order to grow the consulting business.
So John, I see you have your hand raised. Feel free to jump in.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you, David. Thanks, Zoe. So about the churn on the list, do you go through, and because I did this a while ago, and I made it so people had to re-opt in, but do you just go through and just take people off, or just the people that aren't responding only talk? Because I obviously don't want to make people opt in who are reading, because that doesn't make sense. So yeah. Do you just look at the people who just aren't responding, the kind of, there's, I forget the term for it, but those people, and just say, do you want to stay in? Is that what you're doing? How often do you do that?
Yeah, so great question, because I would say that how of churn is a lot harder than just the idea of it. So the way that we do it, which of course there could be a million ways to do it, and it's something we're still perfecting, and it's actually something that we just hired someone who's a lifecycle marketing manager, and her responsibility is going to be basically engagement and retention. So she'll probably revisit how we currently do it. But the way that we currently do it is monthly, we go in and we look at everyone who has not opened for the last 120 days. So 4 months. And then we download that list and we send them a last email like, hey, we know things are busy. You know, we understand, basically an empathetic message, give them the opportunity to opt back in by clicking. And then 3 days later, which again isn't an exact science, it's just we want to give people a couple of days to respond to that email, because people don't read their emails overnight always. 3 days later, we go back in, download the engagement on that email campaign. Anybody who clicked that email gets removed from the churn list. So we have that initial list from early in the week. We do it Monday to Friday. Monday, we have that initial list of everyone who hasn't opened in the last 120 days. And then by Friday, we have the people who clicked the re-engagement email. We subtract them from the original list, and then we remove the remaining churn list. So that's the way that we do it. And then the author of Not a Newsletter, I see that in the chat, it's Dan Oshinsky. I might misspell it, but I'll try to drop it here. And then John, did that answer your question?
Yes, that's perfect. Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Zoe. I feel like we covered so much and so many great insights. How can we, how can we follow you? How can we follow Morning Brew? How can we express appreciation?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are important, but potentially more important, a couple of resources that will help you guys do your jobs. As I said, Dan Oshinsky is a big one. He just really helps like keep your finger on the pulse of the email space. Another that I love, like I said, is this program Reforge that I did. It is like a very intense 8-week program, but I am sure they have resources online, and I would get on their email list. I'm not sure if they send out, content related to this. That would be good. Another is there's a newsletter called The Media Operator that is actually written by the general manager of B2B at Morning Brew. He founded that a couple of years ago. I think it's a really good newsletter about the media space. And then a couple others that I can think of. There's this great book called Get Together. It's a workbook, and it's all about how to build community with, not for your people, how to build community in a very collaborative sense with your audience. And I think finally, I would recommend, because Morning Brew has this ethos of building in public, there's a ton of resources online where people at the company have written Medium posts or like tweet threads about how they think about growth or how they built the referral program or how they did this, how they did that. So obviously not all of it is completely up to date, but there's so much rich material that I would recommend if you're interested in our story or the way that we have been able to grow the business that we have today. And so, yep, I would just definitely recommend, if you are in the target audience and and would be befitting, to subscribe to Marketing Brew or Retail Brew, Emerging Tech Brew, and then of course the daily newsletter as well.
Awesome. Great resources. And this has been such a great conversation, Zoe. Thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, it was so great. And if you guys want to be in touch with me, I'll share my email with David. Happy to answer other questions offline.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, guys.